Tim Brooks, today I would like to talk to you about your book, Writing Beyond Writing, which I've been privileged to see the manuscript of. I have some questions about it, and a lot of them really aren't questions about why you're writing the book. So, I sort of get the sense of that, although I'd like to get into that. And certainly not what the book is about exactly, although I would like to get into that as well. But more questions about what's behind some of the things that you've said in the book. There are things that you've said that I've read that were absolutely fascinating. And when I thought about them, I thought, okay, let's take this to its logical conclusion. To me, it hinted at something really fascinating about our relationship to writing and the relationship of writing to culture. So those are some of the things that I want to ask you. But I guess let's not put the cart before the horse. First, tell us a little bit about the book. What is it and why are you writing it? And then, we'll get into some of the deeper questions.
Okay. So in my mind, my history with the Endangered Alphabets Project, which began informally with the first exhibition that I carved in 2010, and then became more sort of official a couple, 3 years later. It really falls into two parts. So one part is kind of the voyage out, the journey out into the world of Indigenous and minority scripts and discovering them and finding out absolutely fascinating things about them as forms of writing, as forms of anthropology, as forms of political economics. And much of those discoveries is in our Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, which is going to be appearing actually in print form next year. And all of that is just, wonderful and amazing stuff. The second phase really began a couple of years ago when I began asking myself questions that kind of imply a journey back, or at least a looking back. So given all of these extraordinary examples of writing in a very broad sense, what does that suggest about our own writing beliefs and traditions in the West, and even our definitions of and understanding of writing in the West? So I feel as if I've had this very, very kind of rare and privileged opportunity to look and think about writing from a much broader set of points of view than is generally the case. And being a writer, myself, this has led me to literally re-examine all of my beliefs and assumptions about writing.
And that, I think, probably is a good place to get into one of the I don't know if I want to say the key themes, but something that really stood out to me when we were talking, or when I was looking at the book, because it feels like there's this sense woven through it that writing is the act of writing, and what we think about writing and how we think about writing are as deeply woven into and informed by and inform our cultures as much as the spoken language does in their own way. And what I'm thinking of is this particularly. I think it's in the first third of the book, you talk about the story of the 10 Commandments and how this was, essentially a contract between God and Moses. And it was literally written in stone, as we use the phrase today. And it got me to thinking, I compared that to, experiences I've had in many of the jobs that I have held, including my job now as a consultant, where, if you want to know something for sure, you put it in writing. If you want to create a paper trail of something, you put it in writing, right? Even the phrase paper trail. even though now it's an electron trail. But we have this idea that things that are in writing are more solid, they are more reliable, they are more evidentiary. And I'm wondering what kind of cultural shift it brought about, the invention of writing, and what preceded it. In other words, if you go to a culture or a linguistic group that hasn't developed writing, are rules of evidence different? Is what is considered proof different? Is a measure of reliability different? Because the reason we say we're going to go on writing is because if it's an oral conversation between two people, no other witnesses, then how do you know who's telling the truth? Maybe people's memories are faulty, all of these sort of things. If you're in a situation that inevitably sort of reintroduces those elements because you don't have writing, then does that change how you look at what proof is, what evidence is, even how you would logically reason out things, right? Would your order of operations be different? That kind of thing. What do you think about that? What does it do to a culture to introduce writing in terms of the transmission of, and specifically the reliability of, knowledge?
So, as you were talking, I was thinking, what an interesting question that is, because in a weird way, it's only a question that someone, and this isn't intended as a dig at you, from a privileged culture would ask.
No,
and the reason for that is that not because there's anything wrong with the question, but because where we actually see that issue highlighted is when you have the meeting, the intersection, or the invasion of one culture by another. And so I'm thinking, for example, of friends of mine in the indigenous people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. So here you have people who have been farming in this sort of upland, jungle farmland area for generations, and are self-sufficient. And I don't know how they registered or enforced contractual relationships, but I do know what happened when writing arrived. Kind of what I have in my mind is a meeting of two people, but one of them has a battleship. And in a way, writing is that battleship in a particular way. And so what happened was, after the short but very bloody war of between West and East Pakistan, which led to the development of the independent nation of Bangladesh, you had a situation where you have a new government, you have a new country, and you have a new government that is predisposed not to recognize or even give full citizenship status to indigenous peoples. So what happens then is that Bengali settlers who are backed by the government are given documents that say you have a right to this particular piece of land. And they, I assume that some of them are naive and think, oh, there's nothing there, or there's nobody there already. Some of them are probably very kind of racist and think, oh, it's just this bunch of tribals who are living there. Now I've been given this land by the government. And so when they go to the land that this piece of paper documents, then the fact that the people who've been living there and farming that area for centuries don't have that piece of paper is force of law. And what's more, it's force of law that is then backed up by the military, because if there is any kind of confrontation between the indigenous people and the settlers, then the army is going to side with the people with the piece of paper.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's why I was imagining, when you have this meeting of people, it's never just an equal meeting of people's, one of whom happens to have writing, one of whom doesn't. And so we can't think of writing as a value-free technology or a value-free tradition. You might study it at a distance in that fashion, but only if you have the privilege to be able to do so.
Right.
Otherwise, what's happening is that you're kind of there at the sharp end of the prong, and
Right.
and it may be that writing arrives with missionaries. It may be that it arrives with settlers. It arrives with colonial forces, but it's not. It's never simply. First of all, it's never simply a value-free thing. And secondly, it's never simply a gift. So again, in the West, we tend to say things like, we are bringing literacy to this area because literacy is a de facto good. And that's only true if you can figure out a way to make that gift of literacy be a true gift between mutually respecting peoples. Even then, there are going to be downsides. And Aristotle famously talks about writing not being a good thing because, it weakens your memory. He may have just been, typical Aristotle or Socrates, I can't remember, and just prodding somebody. But nevertheless, until you can have that utterly equal exchange, which is possible you can't ever have, then writing becomes something other than what we think it is.
That's interesting. And two things that come to mind when you say that. One, you're right. The fact that the question would arise is that's the product of having the privilege of being in a system that has writing and that sort of has the option to use it or not or whatever, but that also has been the exporter of writing. Often do. Like you say, it could be with a religious text, it could be at the point of a gun, it could be, on the other end of a cash register, whatever. But yeah, for sure, even just thinking that is 100% a product of that. And I think it's also really important that you point out that it is not a neutral thing. It is not a sort of, like you say, a value neutral thing. There is something that comes with it because the very interaction is loaded, right? It is charged with a power dynamic and an imbalanced power dynamic from the get.
Yes. And along with that, by the way, goes something which, again, I hadn't really thought about until very recently, which is in many, many, many cases, the way writing was introduced was by bringing the Latin alphabet or Roman alphabet and adapting the various characters as well as possible to the sounds of the local language. So there's a couple of things that are really worth thinking about that. One is, quite apart from the obvious one that often you can't do it, it doesn't fit. So one is that if you regard writing as something that is essentially just a toolkit, then you're kind of going, hey, we're just giving these people tools, and therefore we're doing good and all this kind of stuff. And it's only when you start looking at the differences between an indigenously created script and one that's exported that you realize how different the two actually are. So an indigenously created script may well have all kinds of qualities that this supposed toolkit doesn't have. So we've seen in many instances where, especially in Africa, you have a script that is actually based on the kind of graphic traditions of that culture. And so every single character or glyph or letter looks familiar. It looks like the designs that are painted on the sides of houses or incorporated in ceramics or fabric design, etc. And so it's very clearly theirs. And secondly, there may well have been a great deal of thought given by the creator of that script to how to visually represent the sounds of their language, which may well sort of fall entirely outside Western spoken languages. So again, this notion of a toolkit, this kind of value-free or value-neutral commodity is really A, misleading, and B, it flatters us. It flatters us to think in those terms.
That's really true. That's really true. Both thinking of it as a value neutral commodity and thinking of it as an infinitely applicable commodity. Because, I'll often see people say, for example, let me just, I think this is a good example, which touches on a lot of sensitivities, but this subject does anyway. So, you look at the Arabic language as it is spoken, because of course, vernacular Arabic all over the Arabic speaking world is different from modern standard Arabic, which is really nobody's native language. Everybody learns it as a second language. And the spoken version is what they learn first. And if you look at Lebanese, for example, spoken Arabic, which is, a subgroup of Levantine spoken Arabic, so Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian, etc. And you look at the debates that have gone on about in Lebanon, fueled obviously by sectarianism and that kind of thing, about Lebanese Arabic. You see this movement that started wanting to get recognition for the Lebanese variety of Arabic, right? Instead of just having this sort of hegemonic presence of classical / modern standard Arabic as the sole written standard. And with this drive to get recognition for Lebanese Arabic drove some people to and create a Latin alphabet-based way of writing out Lebanese Arabic. And it's a little bit similar to what you would see people in the Arabic-speaking world use in chat in the days before, Arabic keyboards were really available. It was before smartphones and keyboards were electric or electronic, and so you could encode it however you wanted it. But something that I thought was interesting, two things really. One is, it makes you think of the chat Arabic that was used, that used numbers for certain sounds that letters wouldn't be able to, Latin alphabet letters wouldn't be able to convey. And then thinking of this script that was occasionally, and is still occasionally, promoted in Lebanon based on the Latin script. One of the arguments for it was that, well, the Arabic script doesn't represent the sounds of Lebanese Arabic faithfully. Fair enough. That is true. Lebanese Arabic has a larger vowel inventory, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that the Latin script represents it any better. And so, it reminds me of what you're saying, talking about indigenously derived scripts. The alphabet that would probably most faithfully represent the sounds of Lebanese Arabic would be one that the Lebanese people devised. Perhaps it looks a little bit like Arabic, looks a little bit like Latin, a little bit like Greek, whatever. But that is something completely, not any of those things is completely new, even if it's a composite of other things, and made specifically to reflect the phonological realities of that language. And so that's a long way of saying that what you're saying puts me in mind of the fact that we don't really get scripts that are fit for purpose in terms of being really accurate and organic reflections of the spoken language unless they're indigenously derived or have been being used within a speech community for many, many years, and some standardizations have happened, like has happened with English. That's why there's 5 vowels in written English and like 27 vowels in general American. So, we just have sort of decided that this one letter can stand for 5 different sounds. But it's just interesting.
Can I pick up on one particular word that you use, which I think is really, really central to all of this?
Mm-hmm.
So you use the word recognition.
Mm-hmm.
So, like most people, I'm sure, as I was growing up and starting to become educated and learn about the world, I would look at maps, and I loved maps and all that kind of stuff. And when you look at a world map, then each country is a different color, because obviously it's convenient to be able to distinguish borders if there are different colors on each side. And if we consider the source of those atlases and maps, then we realize that these represent the worldview of people who are either going to have to administer those areas or going to have to deal with the people who administer those areas. And they're not written from the point of view of people who live in those areas. And so if you look at, for example, Sudan and Chad, which are right next to each other, right? They're different, they're different colors. And if you imagine that, for example, you are a reporter covering some incident there, then you're trained to find a representative of one side, okay, Sudanese government, and a representative of the other side, the Chadian government. The notion that within any of those kind of monochromatic areas, let's say Sudan is orange and Chad is yellow, the fact that actually on the ground, it doesn't feel like that in the slightest, right? Not only do the Sudanese not feel orange, but they don't necessarily even see themselves as Sudanese, or if they do, they may well see themselves as distinct from their neighbors, whom they may be friendly with, they may be, warring with, whatever. And of course, there are many peoples, I'm thinking of the Zagawa people, who live on both sides of the line. And the issue of recognition, therefore, is really an issue that has to do with the relationship between the worldview of the governors, which is it's more convenient to deal with people in large bodies, and in particular, to deal with the people who are in power or in control of those large bodies. It is to deal with all of the individual cultures and peoples within them.
Right.
And the place where you see this absolutely in ferment right now, in creative ferment, is India. So up until 1947, you have this sort of bizarre panoramic picture of India, which is, it's the British Raj. We'll make it pink because all the British areas are pink. And it covers this big, kind of blot on the landscape, which goes from the Himalayas, down to the Indian Ocean, this whole thing. And what that really means is the British government administers that area as well as it can and as in the ways it thinks fit. After partition, when you have the end of colonial rule, and you also have the beginnings of this whole religious divide, which was done with appalling clumsiness and fatal clumsiness, the Indian government decides to create states that are actually linguistically based, which is fascinating. I don't know of other countries that have made that decision, then I don't know everything by a long way. And so what happens then is that you have a relatively new country with at least 1,000 different languages, and many, many, many different scripts, but it only can afford to recognize some of them administratively, because if the government wanted to send out important news about a cholera outbreak to everybody who might be affected, then it would be sent out, in 416 different languages. So you have, on the one hand, the desire to recognize such an incredibly diverse nation, but on the other hand, you have the question of how do we actually organize things. And so consequently, what has happened ever since then is that India has become the epicenter for script creation in the world. And even at this moment, I was talking to somebody 4 days ago who is in charge of indigenous language development in the state of Karnataka, and tells me that there are 4 scripts in development in Karnataka alone, because a script is tied intimately with the notion of recognition. It's the sense that we have been here all along. We have spoken our language, we have done our dance, we have had our music, we have, raised our crops, whatever the particular identity is. And we did so under the British Raj, even though we were apparently pink at that point. And now we are part of a different unity, which is defined by language, but our language is not on the official schedule. It's not a recognized language. And in order to be recognized then, and to especially to be acknowledged by our neighbors who may be official and may therefore look down upon us, we're going to create or recreate or find from history or make from scratch a script that we can call our own. And so the issue of recognition is, in a sense, part of the grand decentralization of power in the world that is taking place, obviously, in some areas more than in others, in some areas more rapidly than others. In Indonesia, which was Indonesian, right? One language, one script. We're now getting individual governors of individual provinces who are saying, actually, we liked the fact that we had our own language and our own script, and we're going to start to reintroduce it in various ways. So the whole notion of respect and recognition is in many ways at the heart of all of this.
That's interesting, because I feel like it ties into something we talked about before, saying that having a language, or having writing is a way to create that physical proof that we are here. We are taking up space. We deserve to take up space. We have been here for, just as long as anybody else. And now here is some proof of our existence. So, it gives outsiders something to recognize, something to acknowledge. And so that it puts me in mind of that. And also this way of using the written word, in this case, not just the spoken word, as a way of sort of staking out, like setting out your stakes of identity.
Yep.
The closest analog I can think of to, the language-based districting in India is in the Balkans, the breakup of Yugoslavia. And all of a sudden, the language that until 1989 or 1990-ish had been taught as Serbo-Croat is now Serbian and Croatian and Bosnian and Montenegrin, and separate languages with separate standards, totally mutually intelligible, right? Sure, some maybe accent or vocabulary differences, and speaking as somebody who does not speak any of them, I'm just going off what, first language speakers have told me. Nothing, for example, there is no difficulty for a Bosnian communicating with a Croatian that somebody, a Californian, would have wouldn't have with somebody from Edinburgh or something like that. Probably less, actually, just because of geography and history and all of that kind of thing. And yet, there was this very strong and ultimately successful drive to have those all recognized as independent languages, as a way of establishing ethnic identity. And of course, there's a whole history behind that, especially with the breakup of Yugoslavia and what happened there. But it's just interesting because it kind of reminds me of that, like that way of using language, again, written in this case, to sort of demarcate, okay, here I am, here is my group, here is the group that I belong to, the group that I identify with.
Right.
And
Right.
And now one step further, and now recognize it.
And actually that really brings in one of the most loaded words in linguistics, which is the word dialect. So the word dialect is very frequently used as a way of doing two things. One, to demean a particular group by saying this is the real language and they only speak a dialect, as if they're kind of barely comprehensible and they're speaking in like grunts. And that is then also tied in with recognition. So if you say that this group really speaks our major language, but is just a different dialect, then what you're also implying that they don't deserve recognition in any official capacity because they're really no different. And again, you see this happening in India, but you also see it happening, throughout Southeast Asia. In many ways, you see it happening in the early days of the language revitalization in Europe, in Italy, for example. The whole idea that, there are not separate, Neapolitan is not a separate language, it's just a dialect.
You definitely see it in all of those. You see it too currently with, going back to our example from earlier, you see it with Arabic. This idea, often religiously driven, granted, but not exclusively, that modern standard Arabic or classical Arabic those are the correct forms of the language. And anything that varies from that is, again, like you say, a dialect. And that's, Lebanese Arabic, Tunisian Arabic, whatever, are often talked about as dialects, sometimes just as a way to differentiate them, it's just for ease, but sometimes it is with this idea that they're a lesser form of the official, the correct one, right? And so and again, that does get into this idea of recognition. And there are very few officially Arabic-speaking countries that are, where people are really lobbying hard for the recognition of their particular variety of Arabic. That may change in the future, who knows? But we see how all these ideas are woven in together. And I think also we see, going back to the Balkan example with Bosnian and Serbian and all of that, we see again how the written word fits into that, because when these languages decided that they were going to be separate languages and not just versions of each other, whatever the reality of that in terms of mutual intelligibility, maybe. When they decided they were going to be separate languages, there was in many ways, or oftentimes, a decision to be made then on what script to use. Was it going to be Latin? Was it going to be Cyrillic? Was it going to be a modified and each one sort of chose its own path, and is often one of the easiest ways to distinguish them to this day is, how did they modify the Latin alphabet, or how did they modify the Cyrillic alphabet to write themselves or to express themselves in writing?
Well, actually, let's not forget glagolitic, because you're actually getting the use of sporadic and vernacular use of the revival of the Glagolitic script, especially in Croatia,
Very true.
because again, it's a way of saying, especially after the Yugoslav Civil War, it's a way of saying we've been here all along. We predate all this recent kind of messiness. And so it's turning up. For example, you'll go into a town, and the sign saying, you are entering this town, will of course be in Croat, but also you may well the town may have added a sort of a transliteration into the Glagolitic script, which is at this point not only 1,000 years old, but has not been actively used on a day-to-day basis for at least 100 years.
Something you just said there, I think it really sparked something in me, because you're talking about civil war, and the Yugoslav Civil War, and what happens as sort of a result of civil wars. And right after that, you said, that way of saying, hey, we've always been here, right? And the revival of the Glagolitic script based on that. And what it makes me realize is that built into the idea of every civil war is built into every civil war is the idea on all sides, on the partisans, on the partisans of all sides, that they have a claim to the space that they are occupying, because otherwise they just leave, right? Like you wouldn't even go through the pain of having a civil war if one of the sides said, we want to do what we want to do and we're going to leave and go do that. Then it's not a civil war, it's a secession. But I mean, if they just leave the territory entirely, then
right.
But no, built into the Civil War is this idea that we have the right to do whatever it is we're thinking about doing in this particular place. And then usually you have to hang that claim on something. And oftentimes it is historical presence, right? It's historical presence and or indigeneity that you're sort of, those are where you're putting your stakes. And so it's interesting to me. I feel like we see, the more we talk about this, again, it seems like something that doesn't really have much to do with language and certainly doesn't have anything to do with writing, but it does. It actually very much does. They are deeply intertwined ideas and concepts. And the same impulses that in extremis can lead to civil war are some of the same that lead people to create indigenous writing systems as a way of announcing their existence, staking a claim for their existence, and asking for and or demanding recognition.
And we've said quite a lot about creating indigenous scripts sort of de novo. But we can also look at instances where scripts that had either kind of gone underground or had not been used at all, in some cases for centuries, then get kind of brought back into the light. And I'm thinking of a couple of examples. So if we go back 2,000 years, we see the Amazigh people all the way across North Africa, from the Canary Islands to the western borders of Egypt. They don't have a country because that's not how they live, work, or operate. And over the course of those 2,000 years, first the Romans come across the Mediterranean and establish outposts, then the Arabs arrive, and then French, Italians, etc. much later. And in all of those countries, there is no one country where the Amazigh people actually are in charge. And so consequently, you have this really interesting phenomenon with endangered alphabets where they take refuge where other people don't want to go, in the far north, frozen north, in jungles, in the deserts in this case. And so you have the Tuareg people who are using characters from the Libico-Berber script from 2,000 years ago in tattoos, and then also later in jewelry design. Something which was taught to them by the Jews, interestingly enough, a whole kind of cultural addition that came in, obviously in the second millennium AD. And so when you get the beginnings of a insurrection by the Amazigh people and this desire for self-determination, which is the 1960s, basically, then one of the things they do is design a flag. And in fact, I have that flag right here. So here we have the flag, and right in the middle of the flag is the letter Yaz. And the letter, that's a version of script that can be found engraved in stones that have been dug up that are 2,000 plus years old. And so even though the script that was created or recreated by the Amazigh resistance, in the 1960s and subsequently, was a sort of an updated version of that Libico-Berber scriptum was called Tifina. It's just a brilliant way of saying, here's our flag. It's not the flag of any particular existing nation, it's our flag. And at the heart of it is this visual symbol that you can see in places 2,000 years ago. So we, as you said before, we were here first. We were here all along. And now, if you go to Casablanca and you go to the King Mohammed V airport, then the writing on the airport frontage, in addition to the standard versions, which are, Arabic and French, is there in Tifina. And that struck me as being a fascinating piece of signage, because the airport is associated with the country's relationship with the world, both outgoing and incoming, and also to money, because airports are kind of through passages of investment. And the notion that Morocco will have got far enough as to be able to say, yeah, we're going to finally recognize our Tifina, our Amazigh ancestry. And by the way, people of Amazigh descent are actually a majority, not a minority in Morocco, is an extraordinary visual statement. And it's one that is really all about what we've been talking about, which is recognition and reclaiming one's right to have a footprint on the earth.
And I like that idea that you're talking about right there, saying, you put it on a flag and it's like, do you see this thing on the flag? You'll see it here on the land as well, from as far as 2,000 years ago. And it becomes like that. I mean, it brings the conversation full circle, sort of it becomes that written proof, right? It's not a contract or anything, I grant you, but it becomes that written proof that, hey, we were here. We had a presence here. We literally left our mark on this land, and we're here to this day.
Stop right there. That is a great ending.
Thanks so much.